السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. As Brother Mumsy mentioned, with regards to these lectures which are taking place, from my own experience over the last maybe 6, 7 or 8 years, many of the questions that I've faced in masajid, in schools, Islamic centers across the country, they're around these topics. So, there's lots of questions out there at the forefront of where Muslims are going to be working or studying, or the people that they meet who aren't Muslim, etc. So inshallah we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He keeps our intentions sincere, and that everything we do is purely for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and for the betterment of the Muslims, and so that they're able to equip themselves, educate themselves, and so that they're able to defend Islam. Because wherever you go, and whichever time period you consider of history, there's always going to be different challenges and different questions that the non-Muslims will throw at the Muslims to try to misguide them or try to cause doubts in their hearts. And so these types of issues, they weren't issues 1,000 years ago, or even 500 or 200 years ago. The issue of slavery is a recent thing. These questions weren't asked until after the whole concept of slavery was slowly abolished in the last century or two. So again, these issues are issues which are relevant, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. And today inshallah we're going to be focusing on slavery in Islam. And again, it's one of those topics which maybe even us as Muslims may try to avoid, because we feel like it's something that's a topic that maybe we shouldn't discuss, or we're not comfortable discussing because of course, the connotations that are attached to the word slavery itself. And that's even more of a reason why we have to talk about it. Because, if you don't talk about these topics, especially to those who aren't educated in Islam, or those whose hearts aren't firm in Islam, and you gloss over these topics, you give a vague answer, you respond by throwing accusations towards their religions, you don't answer, the questions that people may have about Islam and slavery, etc., then they're going to go somewhere else. They'll go to people who aren't possibly even Muslim to try to find answers about why Islam does this or why Islam does that. And then they'll end up just leaving Islam. They won't get the answers from Islam and from scholars themselves, or from du'at, or from people who have knowledge, or people who research and study these kinds of things. And so it's always good to talk about these things from a Muslim perspective, from a Muslim, so that at the very least Muslims who maybe aren't as educated won't think to themselves, these Muslims, they're just hiding. Muslims are just hiding these types of issues and these concepts, women in Islam, and animals, and slaughtering animals, and there's killing animals, and slavery has been a part of Islam. So when they start thinking this way, they'll start thinking that Muslims have something to hide, it's something bad, it's not something which Islam has an answer for. And so they'll end up leaving Islam. And this is the case today. We'll see many people who have left Islam for many different reasons. So with the issue of slavery in Islam, from an Islamic perspective, one of the first things we have to say, one of the most important things we have to mention, is when we think of the term slavery, just simply this word, it's a loaded word. It's a loaded word, and it brings about specific connotations, specific images in our minds. When we think of the word slavery, what do we think? We think of specifically which type of trade? The American black slave trade. And when we think of slaves, we think of people who are chained up, tortured, whipped, out in the cornfields, of a darker complexion, black people, etc. And this couldn't be farther from the truth when it comes to Islam. That's why straight away when you think slavery, you're doing an injustice to the Islamic perspective. Because the issue of slave, from the technical definition of the word itself, isn't really what slavery is called or is from an Islamic perspective. So in Islam they call it riq. Riq is the actual word. And it's different to slavery, as we'll see inshallah in this lecture. So first of all, what is the definition of slavery? If we looked in a dictionary, if we looked at the meaning of slavery, there's a few different meanings of this word. One of those meanings of slavery is a condition of having to work very hard without proper remuneration or appreciation. A condition of having to work very hard without proper remuneration or appreciation. So, I think some of us might consider ourselves slaves. Because it's a condition of having to work very hard. We work hard. We've got these jobs. We haven't had a pay rise in such a long time. And without proper remuneration, meaning reward pay financially, or appreciation. No appreciation for the effort that we make at work. The slave drivers. That's what we say. Another definition, a civil relationship whereby one person has absolute power over another and controls his or her life, liberty and fortune. And if you think about this meaning, as we'll see, this actually still exists today. A civil relationship whereby one person has absolute power over another and controls his or her life, liberty and fortune. There's family members who are under this kind of situation. You know, spouses, wives, children, other people. And also from an Islamic perspective, as we'll see, a person doesn't have power if he owns a slave, doesn't have power over his life, doesn't have power over his liberty, meaning his freedom, and doesn't have power over his fortune, his finances. Because he owns his own wealth, he's able to ask for his own freedom, as we'll talk about, and his life is his own life. It's still worth whatever a normal human being's life is worth. The third definition of slavery is work done in harsh conditions for low pay. Work done in harsh conditions for low pay. Again, some of us could say my conditions are harsh. You know, my situation is difficult and I'm not paid that much. So when we look at these definitions of slavery, it should give us an idea of what exactly slavery is. And whether or not it's something which is a thing of the past, because you know the argument is nowadays, you guys are behind. You know, this is the modern era. You know, we don't have slaves anymore. And we'll see that actually we do. There's still slavery in the world today. But they'll say this, because they're ignorant, they'll say, you know, there's no slavery today, you guys still believe in slavery, you know, and they'll mention this, they'll mention different things. And so they'll try to make it out as if there's no such thing as slavery today. They'll use it to kind of show the modernity of society today. So again, with these definitions, it shows us, actually, if we look at these definitions, it still exists, as we'll see. So the history of slavery, since time began, as they say, or since the beginning of time, since we know of, since recorded history was, you know, first recorded, there's always been a mention of slaves. And before Christianity, years before Christianity, it said that that's when slavery became prominent and more popular as a result of poverty. So there was more poverty, so of course if somebody can't afford to pay for his own food, to provide for his own family, you know, for the food, for the clothes on his own back, he would resort to being at the service of somebody else. And as a result of more land, so people owned more land, and they would require people to work for them, and so the people would end up becoming enslaved. And it's interesting that people focus on Islam, but there's also, you know, other traditions which talk about slavery. For example, in Judaism, they have different laws regarding slavery depending on where the slave came from. So, for Hebrew slaves, for slaves of a specific background, or for debt slavery, a person who is a slave as a result of debt. So he owes money to somebody else. This individual, in the Jewish tradition, he can only be a slave for 6 years. So a person who's in debt, let's say he borrowed money from someone and now he's in debt, he can't pay it back, he has to become a slave. And under Judaic law, this person is allowed, the one who is owed money, he's allowed to take this man as his slave for a period of 6 years. And a pagan slave, somebody who wasn't a Jew, is able to basically be a slave permanently. He can be a slave until he's dead, basically. For the rest of his life, he's considered to be a slave, even though the situation, the circumstances may be the same. Also in the Old Testament, slave beating is mentioned. The act of beating slaves is mentioned, and it talks about the punishment. And it says that if the slave dies straight away, there's a penalty. If the slave doesn't die straight away, then there's no penalty. The master's fine, he can carry on, he'll get some other slaves, and he'll do whatever he wants to do. So if the person doesn't die straight away, there's no penalty. And in the past, it would be passed down, generation to generation. So children from those slaves will also be slaves, etc. And traditionally, slavery wasn't actually racial. It wasn't actually racial. It was just whoever maybe couldn't afford to pay off their debts would become a slave. Somebody who was, for example, a woman whose family had died, her husband had basically gone to war and hadn't come back, and no one to support her, she would maybe end up resorting to prostitution or slavery, So these things would take place. Nowadays, slavery still exists, because it's just called by another name. And the actual concept, the basic principle of what a slave is still there. So for example, forced labor. We mentioned those definitions at the beginning. Forced labor, forcing people to work in difficult conditions for low pay without any appreciation or remuneration, that's a type of slavery. And so if we see, for example, in China, where they have, I think Apple have like a factory, and they have Chinese people working there in cramped conditions, in difficult conditions. They're like 10 people living in a room or 15 people living in one room, and they work crazy hours without any real type of real high reward or a good salary. This is a type of slavery. So forced labor. And also if you think about the Middle Eastern countries, it's a similar thing. Whether you want to accept it or not, it's happening. Prostitution, that's a type of slavery. Because they're doing things with little reward, and they don't have control over their lives, they don't have control over their finances, they're not able to leave where they're going to go. So that's also another type of slavery. Human trafficking, which is actually happening in this country. Human trafficking, people bring people over from Eastern Europe, for example, promising them a better life, a British passport, etc. And so when they end up coming, they'll end up working in a nail salon, for example. And there's articles, on the BBC website, on the internet, that mention this. That's a big problem. Debt slavery is something which also exists. Inmates in prisons. There's a big issue in America where inmates in prisons are basically treated like slaves. How so? The slaves in prisons, these prisons may have deals with certain companies in that state to basically use their slaves to make things for those companies. And this is quite common in the States. So whatever it may be a clothes company, it may be something else. And so the prisoners are sent out to do that work, whether it's in a factory or out in the open, whatever the case may be. So in a way, that's a type of slavery. Also education. Education in some parts of the world. In South Korea, there's cases of people who are studying 16, 17, 18 hours a day. in those countries. So literally, they're just, and there's suicide rates have increased when it comes to students, not just in South Korea, but around the world, especially in the West. And they're studying so hard, day and night, just so that they can have some kind of better future for themselves. But it's a type of slavery because they're young and they're running themselves ragged with little reward. They don't really have any control over their own lives because they're just being, they're stuck in a room, a small room, where they end up just, revising and studying for, the majority of the day and even the night. So people will go to school, for example, in the day, and at night time they'll have an extra school that they'll go to, to study even more. So again, you could say it's a type of slavery. There are 40.3 million people involved in modern slavery across the world today. 40.3 million. 10 million children are in slavery worldwide. 2.1 million people are in slavery in the Americas, North America, South America. 1.5 million people are in slavery in developed economies, meaning like wealthier countries. 16 million slavery victims are exploited in economic activities. 4.8 million people are forced into sexual exploitation. 99% of people trafficked, human trafficking. 99% of them are trafficked for sexual exploitation, women and girls. 4.1 million people in slavery are exploited by governments. And in the US, $150 billion were profited illegally as a result of forced labor in the private economy per year. So per year, in the private economy, 150 billion was made as a result of forced labor. Slavery in the UK is also something which exists. A total of 3,805 people were reported as potential victims in 2016. 2016, slavery. In 2016. In September 2017, in 1 month, 9 people were jailed for offences under that act, under the act of slavery. If you think about, like we said, Muslim countries, Middle Eastern countries, you'll have maids, you'll have workers, and they're also treated in bad conditions. I lived in Saudi Arabia in Medina for 7 years, and you see this. It's not something that's hidden away. It's something you can see. It's clear the conditions that they're in. So you look at all these issues, and you realize actually that this isn't something which is specific to Islam. It's something which is worldwide. The West actually has this problem today, right now, as we speak. And what's also interesting is in 2015, the UK enacted an act called the Modern Slavery Act. The Modern Slavery Act of 2015, where they basically consolidated previous offences relating to trafficking and slavery, to basically stop slavery from continuing. Now, why would you introduce an act called the Modern Slavery Act in 2015 if there wasn't an issue, if there wasn't a problem? So, of course, the point that I'm mentioning, the reason why I'm mentioning all these things and these statistics is to show us that actually the first thing we should say when someone approaches us and asks us about slavery, we should say, well, there's a problem here right now. You're so concerned about what Islam says about slavery. What are you doing about the slavery problem in this country? How are you tackling it? Because obviously everyone will have questions about Islam and they'll use things to attack Islam, but don't throw stones if you live in glass houses. So slavery in Islam, the concept of slavery is completely different when we look at the Islamic perspective as opposed to other cultures. In Islam, if we think about what slavery means, and the status that slaves have, generally speaking, we wouldn't think that they would have a high status, because that's what slaves are. Slaves have a lower status. So they're not allowed to own anything. If you look at America, those people weren't even allowed to have their own names. So the black people, they were given the names of their masters. So when you think of slaves, you don't think of slaves as having power. You don't think of slaves as being influential, being outspoken, being able to speak their mind, having their own money, being wealthy. Any of these things you don't think about. And so, from an Islamic perspective, they had all of these things. You had slaves in the past who were Muslim in Islamic history who were given statuses that are the highest statuses imaginable after prophethood. For example, the wife of Ibrahim alayhi salam, Hajar. The things that she did in Mecca are things we still do to show her respect, and we follow her example. The sa'i between Safa and Marwa. The issue of the Zamzam water. Where did Zamzam water come from? It was as a result of Hajar looking for water with Ismail alayhi salam. And she was a slave. And so if you think about this issue of slaves being looked down upon, slaves being disgraced, that wasn't the case in the history of Islam. That wasn't the case because, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, "Inna akramakum indallahi atqakum," that the most noble of you in the sight of Allah are those who are most God-fearing. The story of Luqman alayhi salam. In the Quran, the whole surah called Surah Luqman, where Luqman alayhi salam is giving advice to his son. The majority of the scholars, to my knowledge, they say he was a slave, an Abyssinian slave. So, he's given a name. His name is one of the names of the surahs in the Quran. And his story is mentioned, his conversation is mentioned, the one that he had with his son. So if slavery and slaves were considered to be lowly and disgraced, and not even regarded as members of society, why would we be following the examples of slaves like Hajar alayhi salam? Why would we be reciting a surah in the Quran named after a slave? Surah Luqman. So these things, just by themselves, should be enough for a person to realize and think, okay, the perspective of Islam when it comes to slavery is something different. It's not the same idea. It's a different thing. It's a different beast altogether. Also in Islam, traditionally, you could only have a slave through war. And even if there was war today, the UN and the rules of the UN, which all countries abide by, and the Muslims, al-Muslimun ala shurutihim, the Muslims abide by the laws and by the rules and by the conditions that are set upon them, it wouldn't be permissible. And also, the whole idea of al-'ada muhakkama. In usul fiqh, there's an idea that customs can take precedence, meaning customs are important depending on where you live. Customs are important where you live in your country. So those are things which are considered the norm in the country that you live in. And so if it's something which is going to, for example, clothing. Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah talks about clothing and saying if you're wearing clothing in a certain country which people will look at and Muslims will be mocked and humiliated and made fun of as a result of wearing those clothes, you shouldn't wear them. And that's simply with clothes. So when it comes to other types of issues like slavery and other things, of course we're not talking about things which are obligatory. Like the salah, you can't say al-'ada muhakkama. It's a custom that we don't pray 5 times a day. That's different because those things are obligatory. With other types of issues, things which aren't a principle or a pillar of our deen, fundamentals of our deen, there's things like these, like slavery, like other things like clothing, for example, that the custom of that land can dictate what is good and what is not good, what's for the betterment of the Muslims, etc. And this is also one of those things. And riq or ama is what's used in Arabic to describe somebody who is a slave. And scholars have talked about how it's different to our idea of slavery that we may think of as a result of what we've seen, the stereotypical view or the realistic view of slavery, especially in the West, especially in the American trade, the American slave trade that they were involved in. But in Islam, scholars have mentioned how a person who was considered to be a riq or a ama, a slave, he was similar to somebody who was a living butler. If you imagine a butler or a maid or a nanny, these names would be more appropriate than to call these people slaves. And traditionally in Islam, they were to be cared for and fed to the same standard as the owners of these people, and clothed to the same standard. And they shouldn't have been treated in an ill manner. So if they were clothed and fed in the same manner, and they looked the same as you, and if you saw them in the house, you wouldn't cross your mind, if you've never been to that house before, if you've never met them before, that this person is a slave. You would think what? That he's a family member. That's what you would think. And so again, the idea of slavery when it comes to Islam is different. Also in those days, it was very common in the past, as a result of war, post-war scenarios, for civilians to be taken as slaves, because that was most of the time the only option. Because in those days, if the men went out to war and they lost the battle and many of the men were killed and the women were left by themselves, what's the alternative if they weren't taken in? The alternative would be that they would end up involved in prostitution. That's what would happen. Or they would end up begging. And this still happens today. So in Syria, for example, as a result of the war, I went for Umrah. And in Medina, I saw Syrian boys, begging, selling, alhamdulillah, some of them were like selling stuff, selling tissues, etc. And they were made fun of, things were thrown at them by some of the workers. And obviously we're not talking about the country as a whole, Saudi Arabia, and I don't want anyone to think that I have anything against Saudi Arabia or any other country. But these are just examples of what happens when there's wars involved in the world. People end up resorting to slavery. And so Syrian children were involved in begging and slavery, and begging and selling bits and bobs here and there. And so you have to feel sorry for them, because there's no other result. There's nothing else they can do. There's no one out there to support them. So you do get this problem after war, especially in those days. We're talking about examples now, but in those days when there was a war and the women had no resort, there was nothing for them except this, that they would be involved in these types of issues. So this was the only resort for them. And in the Iraq invasion, similar things happened. There were children involved in prostitution, etc. So when you make vulnerable people involved, and you leave them to fend for themselves, you're basically putting them into harm's way. And if we look at the example of the Prophet ﷺ during his life, of course he's our example when it comes to this type of thing. He's our example when it comes to how we should interact with others. And we know stories of how certain people were sent to serve the Prophet ﷺ. So essentially they were like slaves, if you want to put it that way. For example, the famous companion Anas ibn Malik. Anas ibn Malik was sent just to serve the Prophet ﷺ until he passed away. And he mentions in a hadith, he says, not once did the Prophet ﷺ ever say to me, why did you do this? Or if only you had done this. Or why didn't you do this? Never did he ever mock me or make fun of me or say or criticize me or humiliate me, even though he was at his service, every single day, 24/7. So this was the way the Messenger of Allah ﷺ would treat those who were considered slaves. And also, the Prophet ﷺ never ever kept a slave for himself, except that he freed them. So by the end of his life, he never ever had a slave, that he had kept. He would have them and then he would free them. And we know one of the greatest companions of the Prophet ﷺ was actually initially a slave. Anyone know who? No, Bilal. Somebody else?
Zayd.
Zayd ibn Haritha radiallahu anhu. Aisha radiallahu anha, she said, if Zayd radiallahu anhu had been alive after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, he would have been the leader of the Muslims. This is Zayd ibn Haritha. And Zayd ibn Haritha was known as Zayd ibn Muhammad. And also he was an Arab. And he was a slave. He was a slave of Khadija radiallahu anha. And when they married, she gifted him to the Prophet ﷺ. Slaves are the most expensive commodity, historically. And so, long story short, Zayd, of course, became Muslim, one of the early converts, one of the first Muslims, same as Khadija radiallahu anha, Ali radiallahu anha. Some say this second person to become Muslim after Khadija radiallahu anha. And the ayahs came down about how he can't take the name of his, an individual can't take, an adopted son can't take the name of his adopted father. Because it's a case of lineage. Everyone should know where they came from, their roots, their asl. And so his name was changed to from Zayd ibn Muhammad to Zayd ibn Haritha, his original father's name. Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu anhu, he says that we always knew him as Zayd ibn Muhammad. Meaning, he never even realized that this man was the adopted son. He thought he was the actual son of the Prophet ﷺ. That's how, and what does this show us? How he was treated, how he was taken care of, he was like his own son. So much so that when the family of Zayd radiallahu anhu came, when they found that he was still alive, after many years, they wanted to take him back. And so they said, come back with us. And so Zayd radiallahu anhu said, no, I'm going to stay with the Prophet ﷺ. I don't want to go back. Can you imagine a slave or somebody who's been away from his family, doesn't know if they're alive or dead, they don't know if he's alive or dead, they find him, he wants to go back to his family, live with his own people. But Zayd radiallahu anhu, and again this shows us how well he must have been treated to choose the Prophet ﷺ over his own family members. Over his own family members. That really shows us the level of treatment, high treatment and good treatment that the Prophet ﷺ had for Zayd radiallahu anhu. And this was the case for his slaves. Also, the status of slaves is such that they have the highest status in Islam. Why? Historically, in the early days of Islam, because they were the first ones to become Muslim. They were the first people to accept Islam. Zayd ibn Haritha. You have Ammar ibn Yasir. Yasir and Sumayya. The first who were killed. You have Bilal radiallahu anhu. You have all these different companions who were slaves. And they've been given the highest status. Because the greatest of the companions are the Muhajirun. The ones who did Hijrah. The first people to accept Islam. Because those who came later, no doubt they were companions, but they never suffered and they never went through the ordeals that the first Muslims went through. They'd been through a lot more. They'd experienced a lot more. Killing and oppression and violence and harm and torture, etc. So, slaves were the first to accept Islam. The Messenger of Allah ﷺ also told us about how, and this hadith is a hadith where he said, and I don't know where the sources of this hadith, I wasn't able to find it, but the hadith says that I will testify, ﷺ, he said, I will testify on the day of judgment against a man who captures a free man and sells him into slavery. Because in Islam, you don't capture somebody who's free and make them a slave. And of course, the American slave trade was based on this. They were free people. They were free men. And so the fact that there was a limited way of having a slave shows us that eventually the idea in Islam of freeing slaves and slaves decreasing was simply natural. Because there was so much reward when it came to freeing slaves. For example, if a person broke an oath, if a person did something else, many times the penalty was Raqaba, freeing a slave. So the idea was there, showing us how in Islam, slavery was something which was going to be naturally reduced as a result of people freeing slaves. Also, freeing a slave, based on these things that we mentioned about Raqaba, freeing slaves, the idea of freeing slaves was similar to giving life. It was similar to giving life, because you're giving freedom to a person who would be considered a slave. And in Islam, there is no injustice. So when we have issues and we have questions about slavery from an Islamic perspective, we have to understand first of all, and these are the basics of Islam, that Allah is al-adl, Allah is just. And so there is no injustice. And many times what happens, and this is a weakness of our iman, we have these doubts straight away. As soon as some terms are mentioned, some things are mentioned about animals or slavery or whatever the case may be, we start having doubts. Whereas the first thing we must think is, hang on, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is just. So there must be an explanation, there must be a reasonable answer to these questions, to these doubts that I'm having. There has to be. But instead of having this husn al-dhan, these positive thoughts, we end up straight away looking at the negatives and having these doubts. Also, the companions, they were the greatest examples of how to implement the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. And if you look at their lives, Aisha radiallahu anha, in her lifetime, she freed 67 slaves. Now you might think, yeah, that's good, like, that's a good thing, it's supposed to. But if you think about the idea of freeing slaves, imagine if you bought a car, and you saved up to buy a car, and as soon as you bought the car, you gave it away, free. Okay? And that's a car. A human being, okay, who's a slave, that's owned, this individual is worth a lot more than a car. Because obviously it's a human being. And so to free a slave that you own is one of the most expensive commodities that you could own. It's a big thing. You know, imagine buying 67 cars and then selling them as soon as you buy them. Maybe we couldn't even do that in our lifetimes. It's inconceivable. You know, we'd be so proud and happy of having our cars, we wouldn't dream of giving them to anybody except for some kind of price. So again, 67 slaves freed by Aisha radiallahu anha. Ibn Umar radiallahu anha, he in his lifetime freed 1,000 slaves. 1,000 slaves. And there's an interesting story about Ibn Umar radiallahu anha. It said that he would only free slaves, he would only buy slaves and then free them if he thought they were righteous. So every time slaves knew that Ibn Umar was in the masjid for the salah, they would rush to try to pray in the first row. Because then Ibn Umar would see them, they'd be like, yeah, this slave is a good slave, and so he'd buy them and set them free. And so people would say to him, look, you know, they're only praying there because you're here. And he would say, that's not, I don't have any control over that. You know, I'm going to have husn al-dhan, buy them and set them free. But again, it shows us how keen the companions were to follow the example of the Prophet ﷺ. Abdurrahman ibn Auf radiallahu anhu, one of the greatest companions, you know, one of the businessmen, one of the millionaires of his time, he freed 30,000 slaves. 30,000 slaves. So again, you know, you look at these numbers. There were slaves who were considered scholars, from the greatest scholars from the Tabi'een. And these people were at one point or another slaves. So for example, Nafi', the student of Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu anhu, known as Nafi' Mawla ibn Umar. And the title Mawla has continued. Why? Because it was considered a sense of honor. Meaning he was under the guardianship of Ibn Umar. Ibn Umar radiallahu anhu freed him when he was younger. But he continued to stay with Ibn Umar radiallahu anhu to learn from him. And it wasn't like a inferiority complex where he felt like he was forced to stay with him, because there was no reason to be forced to stay with somebody who's freed you, because financially the money is yours. All the money and the wealth that you own belongs to you. So there's no issue of, you know, having to be dependent on somebody else. Why would they stay with these people? Knowledge, to learn, to benefit from them. So Nafi' rahimahullah, one of the greatest scholars of the Tabi'een, he was a student of Ibn Umar radiallahu anhu. And that title was a sense of honor for them. To be attached to Ibn Umar radiallahu anhu. Mawla ibn Umar. Also Ikrimah rahimahullah, Mawla ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu. Ikrimah, the former slave of Abdullah ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu. So again, you look at this history. We're learning from these former slaves. These are our, you know, respected fathers, in the sense that we're learning from them. We're learning from the knowledge which they have. They are the ones who pass down the knowledge from the companions down to us. You look at books of tafsir, you'll see Ikrimah's name, you'll see Nafi''s name, because they were the ones. Abdullah ibn Abbas was a scholar of Quran. And Ikrimah rahimahullah, he went through the Quran 10 or 20 or even more than that, he went through the Quran 10 or 20 times plus, and at each ayah he would stop and he would wait for Ibn Abbas to explain to him what the ayah meant. And then he would move on to the next ayah. And he did this 10, 20, 30 times. Over and over again in his lifetime. So again, the whole concept of slavery from an Islamic perspective isn't generally what we would think. Imam al-Hasan al-Basri has a beautiful story about Imam Hasan al-Basri rahimahullah, when during his time, slavery for whatever reason, maybe related to war, whatever the case may be, slavery increased. So the leader at the time told him there's too many slaves. So give a khutbah telling people to free the slaves. There's too many. So again, this tradition of freeing slaves was something from the early days of Islam. And by the way, this is like, this is 1400 years ago. And it's only recently, in the last 3 or 4 centuries, that this whole idea of freeing slaves was even brought about as a result of the American slave trade. And even in the American slave trade, why wouldn't they? There was a civil war as a result of it. The civil war in America between the South and the rest of the United States. Why did that happen? Because the South didn't want to give up their slaves. That's why you had black slaves fighting against the South. Why didn't they want to give up the slave trade? Because for them it was a case of economy. It was a case of business. It was a case of their businesses not being able to operate if they never had slaves. So the economy was dependent on the slaves that they had. If there were no slaves, there was no business, there was no money. Whereas in Islam, that's not the case. The whole economy isn't based and dependent on the amount of slaves that you have. Imam al-Hasan al-Basri, so he was told that, give a khutbah to tell people to free slaves. So the first khutbah goes by, he never says anything. And so, the leader's thinking, what's going on? Why didn't he do anything? He didn't say anything. Maybe he's preparing his talk or whatever, maybe he forgot. The second week, again, nothing. Doesn't say anything. The third week, he mentions it. And as soon as he mentions it, many people start freeing their slaves, left, right, and center. And so the leader asked him, I asked you 3 weeks ago, what happened? And so he said, I'm a poor person, I don't have enough money, I don't have a lot of money. And so I saved money, and then I bought a slave. And once I bought this slave, I sold this slave. And then I told people to sell their slaves. Meaning, he was an alim who was an amil. He was a scholar who was acting upon what he's preaching. So he wanted to do something himself before telling others to do it. Allah said, أَتَأْمُرُونَ النَّاسَ بِالْبِرِّ وَتَنْسَوْنَ أَنفُسَكُمْ. Do you order the people to do righteous deeds, good things, and you forget yourselves? So Hasan al-Basri went to this extreme, this extent, that he bought a slave, saved enough money, bought a slave and then set them free, and then he told others to free slaves. There's a story of Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, rahimahullah, the famous leader of the Muslims. It said that when he freed his slaves, they were crying. Not out of happiness, but out of sadness. That why did you get rid of us? That we loved being in your company. We loved being, with you in your home. Because of the way they were treated. Because of the way that they were looked after. Because of the status of Umar radiallahu anhu. And so it was this case of them being upset that they were being freed. Also, one of the groups that are mentioned as those who you can give zakah to are firriqab. One of those groups of people that are entitled to zakah are those people who are slaves so that you can set them free. So zakah, one of the pillars of Islam, the charity that's an obligation upon the Muslim. This charity, one of its recipients are slaves who wish to be free. And if that's not a proof and evidence to show that Islam encouraged freeing slaves, then Allah knows what is. There's a famous story of Amr ibn al-As radiallahu anhu, the famous companion who was the governor of Egypt, when his son had a race with a slave, or he was a former slave, Allah knows best. And he was a former slave. And Amr radiallahu anhu's son lost the race against his former slave. and he's like the governor of the governor's son. So he's embarrassed, he's angry, so he whips him. And so this son goes to his father, and they both go to Umar radiallahu anh in Medina to complain. And so Umar radiallahu anh calls Amr ibn al-As and calls his son all the way to Medina. And they come to Medina, and he tells the slave, take this whip and whip Amr's son as retribution, redemption. And so he whips him, and he puts the whip down. Umar radiallahu anh says, now take the whip again and whip Amr, his father. And the son, he says, I don't have no ill will towards Amr radiallahu anh. He never did anything to me, I've got what I wanted. And so Umar radiallahu anh turned to Amr ibn al-As radiallahu anh, and he said, how can you enslave a man that was born free? How can you enslave a man that was born free? And this is actually one of the statements in the United Nations Charter. Every man is born free. Every human being is born free. And they say that is taken from this. The famous companion that we mentioned, Zayd radiallahu anhu, he was one of the leaders and the generals of the armies, of the Muslim armies. And he was killed in battle. His son, Usama ibn Zayd, was one of the most beloved people to the Prophet ﷺ. One of the most beloved people. And Usama radiallahu anhu was also the general of the Muslim army at the age of 16 years old. 16 years old, and he becomes the leader of the Muslim army. Also, we've been told to learn Quran from 5, from the Tabi'een. Learn Quran from 5. One of them is Salim, Mawla Abu Hurairah. Salim, the slave of Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu. So from these 5 people, exemplary scholars from the Tabi'een, is Salim, the Mawla of Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu. The famous hadith and the statement of the Prophet ﷺ, who told us explicitly that there is no superiority of an Arab over a non-Arab. There's no superiority. Nor of a red man over a black man. Meaning just because of the color of your skin, you're not better than another individual. Or of a black man over a red man, except in terms of taqwa. Inna akramakum indallahi atqakum, as we mentioned. Freeing slaves, as we mentioned, is encouraged in Islam. If one breaks an oath, if one breaks a fast, etc. And like we said, it's not something that's needed in Islam to support the economy, unlike other economies of other countries today and also in the past. And also the majority of the Abbasid dynasty and the Ottoman leaders were children of slaves through their mothers. And child slavery, children through slavery are given full rights, just like, for example, Ismail alayhi salam and Ishaq alayhi salam. If you think about it, they were the children of slaves. And slavery also became abolished in Muslim lands around 1870 onwards. So they started to follow the West when it came to the idea of freeing slaves. And if we look at the conquest of Andalusia, the famous general, Tariq ibn Ziyad, he was also a slave. And Napoleon, when he conquered some Muslim lands such as Egypt and other places, it said that he was surprised at how the freed slaves were treated just as well as the average person, the normal regular person who wasn't a freed slave, a former slave. So again, all of these things show us, how Islam viewed slavery, how these slaves were treated, who they were, and their statuses. Now, what are the conditions for slavery in Islam? An individual has to treat them the same as he would treat others, in terms of food and clothing, etc. It's also said that a slave shouldn't be called a slave, and the master shouldn't be called a master, to show this sense of equality. So this is in books of fiqh. Scholars, when they talk about the conditions of slavery, etc. Also they say his wealth like we said, belongs to him. So he owns his own wealth. And most importantly, he can ask for his own freedom. So in a way, it's not even a slave. It's more like we mentioned before, a nanny or a maid or somebody who's a living. Somebody who can choose to leave whenever they want. So they could ask for their own freedom. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَالَّذِينَ يَبْتَغُونَ الْكِتَابَ مِمَّنْ مَلَكَتْ أَيْمَانُكُمْ فَكَاتِبُوهُمْ إِنْ عَلِمْتُمْ فِيهِمْ خَيْرًا. That those who seek a contract with you, a slave, from amongst those that your right hand possesses, then make a contract with them if you know there is goodness within them. وَآتُوهُمْ مِنْ مَالِ اللَّهِ الَّذِي آتَاكُمْ. And give them from the wealth of which Allah has given you. So, when a person is a slave, he can request to be free. And also it said that whatever the amount that's requested from his owner should be an amount that's reasonable and that he's able to give. It can't be an extortionate amount. It has to be something reasonable, something acceptable, something realistic that he's able to accomplish and he's able to give to buy out his own freedom. So, these are just some things that we've mentioned in regards to slavery from the Islamic perspective, and there's so much more that could be said, but I advise the brothers and sisters to go online, research for themselves, and educate themselves when it comes to this topic, because like I said, these topics are topics which are important, and these topics may crop up when it comes to our conversations with those who aren't Muslim, and inshallah we'll conclude here. Any questions? We'll take a couple of questions, inshallah, 2 questions. If there's any questions.
Could you briefly touch on the story of Bilal?
Yeah, so the famous story of Bilal ibn Rabah radiallahu anhu, who, I'm not sure of the origins of how he ended up becoming a slave, whether it was through family or whether he was captured, Allah knows best. But we know that he was somebody who was a slave of Umayyah ibn Khalaf, one of those leaders of Quraysh in Mecca. And of course we know how he was treated. And we know the journey of the story of Bilal ibn Rabah radiallahu anhu, how he was tortured in Mecca for believing in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and worshipping Allah and denying the worship of and rejecting the worship of idols. Umayyah ibn Khalaf would basically take him outside in the scorching heat under no shade, leave him out. And if you've been to the Middle East in the summer, in the summer out without any shade, you don't stay out for like a few minutes even. A few minutes is too much without any shade. So he would leave him out in the shade for the whole day, under the sun for the whole day without any shade. On top of this, he would place huge rocks that had been out in the sun, okay, because that's where the rocks are. They're out under the sun, under the heat, boiling hot rocks. He would place it on the chest of Bilal ibn Rabah radiallahu anhu. And he would tell him to denounce his religion, to worship the idols. And of course we know what Bilal radiallahu anhu would say, Ahadun ahad, one. And this was something which the companions would see and they would hear. And it was something he never ever left. He was committed, he never gave up his faith as a result of the torture of Umayyah ibn Khalaf. And the story goes that Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu went to set him free, and Umayyah asked for a huge amount of money. I can't remember how much it was. And Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu gave it to him. And Umayyah scoffed and said, "You just bought him for an extortionate amount. I'll rip you off, basically. Like, you bought him for such a huge amount of money. He's not even worth a fraction of that." And so Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, he said, "If you had asked for double the amount or 10 times the amount, I would have paid that." And Umayyah is thinking, "Man, I made a mistake, so I asked for even more." And so they mentioned that he became flustered and angry and annoyed. So Bilal ibn Rabah, the famous mu'adhin, the first one ever to call the adhan, ever. And again, this shows us the status of these people, that yes, they were slaves, but they had this status in Islam. The first one to stand on top of the Kaaba and give the adhan after the city of Mecca was conquered again. And this was something which the Quraysh were embarrassed about. It was embarrassing. Like this former slave on top of our Kaaba and calling the adhan. And what's worse? It's the worst thing that could happen to them. The kalima of Tawheed, by a slave on top of the Kaaba. SubhanAllah, it was the worst thing for them. And of course, SubhanAllah, it's a beautiful story about how Bilal radiallahu anhu, when he, during the end of his life, or during the end of the life of the Prophet ﷺ, he will give the adhan, and when the Messenger of Allah ﷺ passed away, he will give the adhan, and when he will get to Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah, he will break down, he will start to cry. He wasn't able to finish the adhan. Out of his love for the Messenger of Allah ﷺ, and how much he would remember him. And again, this is like a slave. And again, it shows us, if they were mistreated, there would be no issues in him giving the adhan. He would continue to give the adhan for as long as he could. Or he wouldn't even give the adhan for other reasons. But we know this through stories and through narrations. And so he stopped giving the adhan. He retired from giving the adhan because he couldn't finish the adhan. He would just break down, he would start crying. And so he retired, he stopped giving the adhan, and he basically participated in some of the battles after that. And at one point in time, when they conquered a new land, Umar radiallahu anhu told him, he called him and he said, give us the adhan. And he said, no, I'm not giving the adhan. He said, just give us the adhan, we want to remember those days. And so Bilal radiallahu anhu stands up and gives the adhan. And the companions just, their heads turned, they're like, what's going on? It's Bilal radiallahu anhu giving the adhan. And it obviously reminds everyone of the time when the Prophet ﷺ. And when he gets to the part, Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah, he starts to cry. And all the companions start to cry. Because of those memories, subhanAllah. So another example of how one of the greatest companions of the Prophet ﷺ, Al-Mu'adhin al-Awwal, the first ever Mu'adhin in Islam, was a former slave. And of course, the Messenger of Allah ﷺ, he said, I heard the footsteps of Bilal radiallahu anhu in paradise. I could hear Bilal radiallahu anhu's footsteps in paradise, and that's a good, glad tidings, because it shows that he will be from those who are in paradise.
Also, Salman al-Farsi was held by the Prophet of Allah.
Yeah, Salman al-Farsi, radiallahu anhu, Ammar ibn Yasir, Bilal ibn Rabah, Zayd ibn Haritha, Suhaib al-Rumi, Suhaib the Roman. Suhaib the Roman wasn't a Roman. Suhaib the Roman was an Arab. Yeah, he was an Arab. He was called Roman because when he was young, the Romans captured him. And they took him to Rome. And also, somehow, he was of light complexion, he had light colored hair. And so because he spent so much time in Rome, eventually when he came back, his Arabic was broken. Couldn't speak Arabic properly. But he was actually an Arab. He hadn't been in Arabia for the majority of his young adult life, his young life. And Allah the best. Okay, inshallah, we'll conclude here. Jazakumullah khair. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to keep us sincere in all our efforts. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم إنه هو الغفور الرحيم وصلى الله وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين.